This video was made possible by the generous support of my patrons. If you would like to join them in helping grow this channel, you can do so at the links in the description below. Throughout the Neolithic era, around 10,000 years ago, humans made a significant historical leap when they learned to cultivate plants, domesticate animals, and settle in one place, laying the foundation of the first civilizations. Within these early societies, food and other means of subsistence were produced and distributed in an egalitarian manner. The concept of private property did not exist, and there was no need for, or hardly any trace of, any form of money. Adam Smith noted that as time progressed, the domestication of herd animals set the stage for trade between different civilizations. He pointed out how herdsmen were uniquely positioned to facilitate early trade relations as they held a surplus of sheep, oxen, or other herd animals, could travel long distances, and engage in trade with faraway lands. Herdsmen also had the advantage of being able to travel with a large stock of goods by hauling it on the back of their livestock. Herdsmen traveling to neighboring civilizations, therefore, became the first to develop a form of money by exchanging parts of their flock for goods with the people that they had met along their travels. Initially, these exchanges may have started as gift-giving, but then gradually evolved into a formalized barter system. However, bartering had its limitations. A herdsman wanting to trade a sheep for shoes would need to find a shoemaker that was also in need of a sheep, which was not always practical. Furthermore, the relative exchange value between shoes and livestock was hugely disproportionate. It would take many pairs of shoes to match the exchange value of a single livestock. We might assume that these limitations would have resulted in nomadic herdsmen trading livestock in return for goods that they themselves had no use for, but may have been useful for others. In other words, it is likely that these nomadic herders would have accepted payment in a wide range of desirable commodities and traveled with a small inventory of goods, thus evolving into an early form of mercantilist trader. Adam Smith argued that as a system of trade emerged, universally desirable and exchangeable commodities such as salt, tobacco, and sugar eventually came to function as early forms of money. Unlike livestock, these commodities had the advantage of being divisible and could therefore be proportioned out in appropriate quantities to facilitate the exchange of equal values. However, these commodities were perishable and needed to be constantly replenished, leading to the introduction of precious metals, namely gold and silver, which were durable, divisible, and less consumable, into becoming the dominant form of money. However, as trade became generalized and the circulation of commodities unfolded at an increasingly broader level, weighing out different proportions of gold became burdensome. Trading a little extra salt, sugar, or tobacco resulted in only marginal differences in value, but when trading in small quantities of gold, minor errors led to large inequalities between the value of goods being exchanged. According to Smith, coins first appeared in ancient Rome around 550 BC under Servius Tullius in order to facilitate a more seamless exchange process. Coins were stamped with their weight to make the value of the metal known without repeatedly having to weigh it before every transaction. The British pound, for example, was originally a pound of silver stamped with the term 1 pound. While coins simplified trade, they also introduced new problems like coin clipping and counterfeiting. Since coins were no longer weighed, some people began trimming the edges and collecting small scraps of metal, thereby reducing the weight of the coin but throwing it back into circulation at its regular price. It also became common practice for this new criminal element to melt different types of cheap metal together, coat it in silver or gold, and then pass it off with the outward appearance of value. Another problem was that most people didn't want to store these heavy coins on or around themselves, where their security was not guaranteed. Therefore, religious temples, which were already guarded, now also guarded and secured coin deposits, thus becoming early forms of what would later become known as banks. When customers deposited their gold in these temples or banks, they were handed paper receipts or banknotes, guaranteeing that their gold was redeemable. Gold was needed for exchange, but now the receipts for gold were as good as gold themselves, and merchants began accepting paper banknotes in place of coins. Eventually, money required little need for physical gold itself, as merchants simply continued using paper receipts as a means of payment. Meanwhile, as banks caught on to the fact that they were sitting on a pile of gold that no one was coming to retrieve, they began lending it out to customers who would repay their debts with interest. This meant that if the bank lent out $100 worth of gold, the borrower would need to repay $100 plus an extra sum of gold. Through this process, banks would continue to increase the quantity of gold they possessed, and it therefore became necessary to constantly expand the supply of gold in circulation. A world historic gold rush commenced throughout the mercantilist period well into the Industrial Revolution. The emerging capitalist economic system had an unquenchable thirst for gold, which was ripped away from the earth at an extraordinary pace. But no matter how quickly or how much gold was removed from the ground, the continued expansion of the economy and monetary system required ever-increasing amounts. A scarcity of gold in a system that required a continued expansion of the gold supply led to the emergence of general monetary crises, which occurred throughout the 18th century as borrowers inevitably failed to repay their debts. In response to the inability of the gold supply to keep up with economic expansion, banks introduced the practice of currency debasement as a means of alleviating the need for an indefinite increase of the gold supply in circulation. In other words, banks began printing and lending more banknotes than what they had in gold reserves. The additional number of paper notes in circulation, without subsequent increase in the gold supply, meant that the price of gold was debased and made more expensive throughout this process. For example, if there was 100 pounds of gold in circulation and $100 worth of paper notes in circulation, this meant that each pound of gold was worth $1. But if the value of paper notes in circulation increased to $200, while the quantity of gold remained at 100 pounds, this would now mean that each pound of gold is worth $2. Therefore, if wage rates remain the same throughout this process of currency debasement, workers would need to labor for twice as long to purchase the same quantity of gold. This is the hidden cost of currency debasement, and a major contributing factor behind inflation. This is also the historical moment when money becomes differentiated by its weight name and its price name, and a pound of silver no longer actually contains a pound of silver. Banks continued to debase the currency from gold until 1973, when the U.S. finally announced the abolition of the gold standard altogether.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
In its place, fiat currency or legal tender, backed by nothing but the law, came into being, and it wasn't long before credit cards and debit transactions came to largely replace paper notes, rendering money almost entirely immaterial. Adam Smith's analysis on the history of money comes to several significant conclusions that Karl Marx's theory later contends with. According to Smith, money operates as a store of value, a measure of value, and a means of payment through domestic and foreign trade. But money only emerges onto the historic scene when two essential preconditions have been met. First, producers must create a surplus of goods. For example, when a baker has produced more bread than what he himself can consume, the surplus bread becomes useless to him and only becomes useful as a commodity for him to sell in exchange for money. Second, in order to produce a surplus, a social division of labor must specialize producers into specific professions. The baker can only produce a surplus of bread if butchers and brewers are also producing a surplus of meat and beer, and can trade these commodities for the baker's bread. Marx agrees with much of Smith's analysis. However, he finds various inconsistencies and points of weakness that need to be further elaborated. Smith's argument rests on the notion that the exchange value of the money commodity, whether in the form of oxen, salt, or gold, ultimately holds some relation to the use value of the commodity itself. But contrary to Smith, Marx points out how at each successive historical stage, the money commodity becomes increasingly useless, until losing virtually all of its usefulness and crystallizing into an immaterial exchange value. When herd livestock emerge as the money commodity, these commodities become bifurcated between having a use value and exchange value. When salt, tobacco, and sugar are introduced, the money commodity takes on the form of a universal equivalent and develops a dual use value. Salt, for example, is used for preserving food, but also used for facilitating exchange. When gold and other precious metals emerge, the usefulness of the money commodity is further diminished, because unlike salt, sugar, or tobacco, which are universally consumable, precious metals contain very little usefulness. When paper emerges as the money commodity, the exchange value and the use value of the money commodity are materialized as distinct entities, whereby paper functions as a representation of value outside of itself. And finally, when digital currency emerges as the dominant money commodity, the immateriality of money almost entirely evaporates any trace of use value, and money is ultimately crystallized into a pure exchange value. With the introduction of paper and digital money, the exchange value of the money commodity is no longer determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time required for its production. For example, previous forms of money, such as sheep, salt, tobacco, sugar, or gold, had a usefulness and value that was determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time required for their production. But with fiat currency, the production of a $100 bill does not require $100 worth of socially necessary labor time, as would be the case with every other commodity. Paper and digital money erase the usefulness of the money commodity, and it comes to represent the value of something outside of itself. The only usefulness that remains of fiat currency is in facilitating commodity circulation. Marx's account of money demonstrates that the physical characteristics of the money commodity are purely accidental and inconsequential, and that the usefulness of the money commodity plays a minor role in the overall historical development of money altogether. Unlike Smith, Marx recognized that money was the ultimate expression of commodity fetishism. Without the fetishism of the commodity rendering every use value an exchange value, the creation or circulation of money would have no significance. It is only when rocks, metals, or pieces of paper are deemed to contain an exchange value that they develop qualities that transcend their physical properties. Prior to the general emergence of exchange values and commodity fetishism, hoarding money or other resources from the community would have been seen as a form of antisocial or even hostile behavior. However, the invention of money gives rise to hoarding because the money commodity is no longer merely a use value, but a store of exchange value as well. It is only when the money commodity takes the form of a commodity that no longer contains any usefulness other than being used as money that hoarding becomes to be seen as rational, and wealth hoarders become seen as virtuous, intelligent, innovative, or philanthropic. As Marx says, money's properties are the possessor's properties and essential powers. Thus, what I am and am capable of is by no means determined by my individuality. I am ugly, but I can buy for myself the most beautiful of women. Therefore, I am not ugly, for the effect of ugliness in its deterrent power is nullified by money. I am brainless, but money is the real brain of all things, and how then should its possessor be brainless? Besides, he can buy clever people for himself. And is he who has the power over the clever not more clever than the clever? Does not money, therefore, transform all my incapacities into their contrary? Money hoarding also laid the foundation of a general system of foreign trade known as mercantilism. The mercantilist system was premised on the notion that national wealth was measured through a favorable balance of trade, where the value of commodity exports was greater than the value of commodity imports, and therefore, the money entering the country was greater than the money leaving the country. Adam Smith was the foremost critic of the mercantilist system by arguing that commodities, rather than money, were the true origin of the wealth of nations, and argued that nations could even benefit from taking on short-term debt to maintain long-term economic stability. Smith's critique of mercantilism dismantled the logic of money hoarding and represented a shift towards free trade to facilitate and accelerate commodity exchange at the level of the world market. Under the system of free trade, nations no longer held on to their money, but threw it back into circulation as capital to generate greater amounts. Money was now used to purchase commodities such as raw materials, tools, machines, land, and labor power to produce more commodities that would be thrown back into circulation and sold at a higher price than what they cost. The process of transforming money into commodities into a larger sum of money is what Marx referred to as the general formula for capital, which represented the establishment of a trade circuit within the system of circulation. These trade circuits were expanded to the level of the world market, where the value of money became universally recognized and traded, alongside a growing system of commodity exchange. The process of commodity exchange is accelerated throughout the development of the stock market, credit markets, and foreign direct investment. This type of credit system allows for the transformation of money into commodities to occur at a faster and broader level. The credit system of money trading gives rise to finance capital as a means of managing the macro-level exchange of money and commodities. Under the system of fiat currency, money is no longer a commodity but a public good controlled by the monopoly of the state, and the role of banks is no longer to protect currency reserves, but issue currency according to macroeconomic indicators such as the unemployment rate. In wake of the Great Depression of 1929, finance capital began developing a refined formula for alleviating general monetary crises like those seen throughout the rest of the 20th century. However, the solutions offered by finance capital to the problem of general crises range from raising or lowering interest rates to intensifying or slowing the debasement of currency. These measures may keep industry on life support, but they are simply insufficient for addressing the underlying contradiction rooted in the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. This underlying contradiction is the contemporary catalyst that will eventually necessitate the transformation of productive relations and usher in a new chapter in the long history of money.